Welcome to Sovereignty in Action. I'm your host, Ian Record. I am honored to be joined today by Fawn, a citizen and president of the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington State. She also serves as president of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and just this morning was chosen vice president of the National Congress of American Indians. In addition, she served as chair of the U.S. Department of the Interior's Commission on Indian Trust Administration and Reform. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington in 1995 and has subsequently received certificates from the National Judicial College at the University of Nevada and in International Human Rights Law from Oxford University. Welcome, President Sharp, and good to have you with us today.
Thank you. Good morning.
So I shared a little bit about who you are, but why don't you just start out by sharing a little bit more about yourself? What did I leave out?
Sure. So I grew up during the 1970s, during the height of the fishing rights controversy in the Pacific Northwest. My grandparents fished for a living. It was a very timely thing for me as a young child. I learned what the word treaty abrogation meant at 8 years old. And I learned that if I went to law school, I could help not only my family secure fishing, but all of the Quinault citizenry. And so that really motivated me and drove me to choose a career in law. I practiced for 10 years, and then our president resigned, and a tribal elder talked to me about running for office. I got elected in 2006, 2009, 12, and 15. I'm now in my fourth term. Next month, I'll have been the president for 10 years. So between my role as lead counsel for the Quinault Nation, as an attorney and president, I've collectively, this May, it'll be 20 years of service to the Quinault Nation.
So let's talk a little bit more about Quinault before we dive into our main topics of discussion. Everybody I sit down with, I just ask them to begin by sharing a little bit more about their nation, their people, their land, their culture. Can you just paint a picture in a couple of minutes of just who Quinault is for those who may not know much about?
Yes, absolutely. Quinault Indian Nation is located on the beautiful Pacific coast. We occupy about 220,000 acres of, in large part, very pristine natural habitat and environment. Within our reservation boundaries, you could find Lake Quinault, you could find clear rivers that are undeveloped from glacier to ocean. You could find 31 miles of Pacific Ocean. You could find mountains. It's just absolutely stunning beaches. It's just a gorgeous place. In our Quinault citizenry, we have close to 3,000 citizens. A good number of our citizenry are under 25, so we're a very young tribe. We have tribal affiliations from 7 other surrounding nations. To be enrolled as a matter of right under our Constitution, you have to have 1/4 blood of either Quinault or one of our affiliated tribes. And we have an 11-member tribal council, 4 executive officers, and 7 council members. We have a very active and robust general council. I'm very proud of our citizenry. Our citizenry not only raises issues with us, but routinely and consistently we'll hear from tribal citizens with their ideas, and they directly engage with the tribal council. In fact, just last week, I had a meeting with our fishermen, some elders, some of our youth were there to talk about how we could really evolve our treaty fishery from a tribally owned business, open up opportunities for individual entrepreneurs, and it was an exciting full-day discussion. So our Quinault citizens are very active, our lands are beautiful, our leaders are really taking the nation to good places right now.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. So as I mentioned, we're going to touch on several topics today, but I'd like to start with how Quinault is working strategically to create a vibrant future for the Quinault people. Between 2003 and 2009, Quinault engaged in a comprehensive community-driven process to identify what that future should look like and how it's going to get there. Can you begin by explaining what prompted Quinault to initiate this process and what was it responding to?
Okay, so when I first got elected, I heard that we had a strategic plan. I heard it was a document that sat on the shelf, collected dust, as do a lot of strategic plans. And from my perspective, I also serve as a trustee to Grace Harbor College, a community college in our county. And I heard a presenter talk about best practices in strategic planning, and they talked about, from a community college perspective, it was not only developing a strategic plan inside an organizational vacuum, but really getting out into the community, that those are best practices. And so I brought that back to Quinault, talked to our executive management team, and I said, look, I want to create a strategic plan that goes outside of our organization. Let's get out into the community and directly engage our citizens, not only to identify their vision, but let's create mechanisms where we could directly engage them in the entire budget process. So planning, and that's the strategic plan, in the decision making, and then when we convene oversight hearings on a quarterly basis to check in with our staff, how well did you do in achieving your performance objectives, your goals? What were the barriers? Was it budget? Was it staff? And have our citizens be part of that process. And so when we put out the call to action, we had over 200 citizens take us up and engage in community dinners, and we had some folks that were there that actually drew out some of the vision. We had some just amazing pictures that showed the heart, mind, spirit of the Quinault people in a picture that was quite dramatic. And so that started a process. And many of our key initiatives early in my presidency came out of that process. We had, for example, the Blueback Restoration Project. In our first open community engagement, a lot of our fishermen talked about how we had millions of sockeye blueback in the Quinault River in the 50s and 60s. And the year I got elected, we only had 4,000. And so we put together a comprehensive plan, and it was in large part driven by our community and fishermen, and that's an example. So we wanted to create a document that wouldn't sit on the shelf, that wasn't in an organizational vacuum, that it was truly representative of the vision that our entire nation brought to bear, and that our tribal elected officials would be included in that process, but our primary charge was not to 11 people draft it and champion it, but our role is to implement and execute as public servants. So more of a servant leadership type of role for our elected tribal council, and the citizens directly engaged, and it was an amazing process.
So you mentioned that the citizens had quite a bit of ownership in this process in terms of articulating what is the strategic vision, strategic plan for the Quinault Nation, not just the Quinault government. What is the ultimate end goal of that strategic plan? What future does it seek to create?
I think the future it creates is, when you're looking at a strategic plan from an organization, you're looking, relatively speaking, short term. I mean, 10 years is a long time in an organizational strategic document. When you're talking about a national scope and the vision that our citizens have, I talked about the Blueback Restoration Project. That's an 80-year project. That's a legacy project. That's something that we would not likely have been thinking of had we been looking at an organizational type of strategic plan that is filled with all these administrative details and the departments and the programs. What are you going to do in 1, 2, 3, 5 years, 10 years? But this truly brought to bear the ability for our citizens to be as open-minded and as broad as possible in understanding. And a lot of the good ideas did come from our elders who've had, 50, 60 years on this earth, and could understand the challenges, the historic challenges. They could see the role that their children and grandchildren have and the future that they want to leave for those children. And so to me, that's the big difference. It's not a sterile administrative tool and document. It's a very vibrant, very dynamic, very broad vision that we created, and those are the type of initiatives that we were able to realize from our citizenry.
So there's 6 themes
Yes.
that this strategic plan is structured around, and I'll just rattle them off real quickly: community, wellness, learning, land, prosperity, and government. Can you describe in a nutshell what those 6 themes seek to advance and how the plan actually functions?
Sure. The 6 themes came about because we didn't want to have silos. If you look at an organization and you have 5 departments, you can have a strategic plan for the Quinault Division of Natural Resources, for Quinault Public Safety, for finance and administration, and they're all in these departmental silos. We wanted to create these overarching themes because we know learning, for example. Every department within the nation should have some component of learning. Every department should have some component of land. So we identified these 6 overarching themes that we wanted the entire organization to work toward collectively and not in a siloed fashion. We also realize that when different departments come together, we can leverage opportunity, we can leverage funding sources, we can leverage an ability to not only hear from the citizens and develop action plans, but when departments come together, it's one where we could have oversight hearings and the council could really relate to how we budget our dollars so that we get the maximum return on that investment. Every single dollar that comes into the nation, we want it to be strategic, we want it to be effective, and we want it to hit those core issues that are top priorities of the nation. So that's how those 6 themes came about. We really wanted to maximize and leverage our resources, knowing that we have very limited federal funding and those dollars keep getting cut back. We wanted the most return on that investment within our administration. We wanted the most service to our tribal citizens. We wanted to identify what issues were important to them. So when we created those categories, a lot of the issues have just fit nicely into those, and we're able to leverage, we're able to maximize our efforts.
So then the hard work begins.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Because as you mentioned, a lot of tribes do the strategic planning process, and then that document collects dust on a shelf. So the hard work begins. In February 2010, Quinault begins to implement this plan, which consists of 2 tracks, strategic initiatives and then preferred future conditions.
Yes.
Those aren't terms you commonly hear. So why this approach to implementation, and what do these 2 tracks involve?
Okay, so the strategic initiatives, that came about because we recognize at a policy level, at a tribal council level, there were certain initiatives that we wanted to champion to provide direction, very clear direction to our staff. Because you could have a strategic plan where it's administrative, you have subject matter experts that develop a strategy around whatever area they're working in, but you also have staff saying, well, we want to know what are the priorities of the leadership so that we can have direction, so we could build our strategic plan around those key policy initiatives and direction. So we then developed strategic initiatives at a council level that annually would, under our Constitution, after our annual General Council meeting, the Quinault Tribal Council gets together within the first 30 days, and we have an organizational meeting. And it's in that venue where we look at the year ahead and we prioritize key initiatives, and then we communicate that to our directors, and they're able to then build a budget and build a plan around implementing. So that's a strategic initiative. It's designed to give clear policy direction to the staff and the subject matter experts so that they can then know that they're very consistent with the leadership and in large part with the community. The preferred future conditions, that again is another term that is a measurement, and it's a metric, not internal in an organizational vacuum. It's a metric you can measure outside of the organization in the community. We wanted conditions of the nation. We didn't want to just look at, did you achieve this goal? Did you perform, this function? Did you spend this budget? No. Did you make a difference in the lives of the Quinault citizens? Did you make a difference in the lives of our landscape? And so those preferred future conditions, this is our preference for the future, and this is how we want the condition of our people and our lands to look. And so it really is a term that we came about just because we knew that we didn't want metrics inside an organizational vacuum. We wanted to be very dynamic and community-driven, community-based.
So as part of this implementation process, Quinault launched what was then known as the Community Roadmap.
Yes.
Very interesting play on words. Which is designed to transform Quinault's governance system. What are the key components of the roadmap initiative, which has since been renamed Quinnovation?
Okay, some of the key components are, we mentioned 2 terms, strategic initiatives and preferred future conditions. But we really wanted to create a roadmap where each staff within the Quinault Nation, from the director down to frontline employee, would have a roadmap of what their mission was for the year. We also wanted to provide to our citizens a snapshot, a picture, if you will, of a roadmap of where we're going. We didn't want to just put a full tank of gas in the car. We wanted a very clear map as to how we're going to get from point A to point B to point C. And so the roadmap was designed to provide the opportunity for our staff to demonstrate concretely, not aspirationally or not feel good, a lot of things you see in strategic plans, but very concrete. By this timeline, this is a goal we're going to achieve. This is the person responsible, and this is the time frame. And so it really helped us as an elected body to then sit down on a quarterly basis, and we just review those metrics. And it also made it very easy to report out to our citizens. This came out of the strategic plan, community meetings. This was a strategic initiative. This is what we designed for the upcoming year. First quarter, this is what we accomplished toward that goal. So the roadmap is designed as a tool for the staff, for the council, the staff in implementation, the council for oversight, and the community to be responsive. So there's one thing that we're doing this year. We're creating director performance agreements where the directors are responsible for key initiatives. We're taking those out, putting them into an annual performance agreement so that we're able to ensure that our directors have very clear expectations that they include in their work product, their everyday work, the needs of our community, and they're responding to our citizenry.
So one of your staff, David Montgomery, who have had an opportunity to sit down and discuss this approach with, described the community roadmap, or now called Quinnovation, as it's designed to streamline Quinault government and make it more responsive to citizens, and you just use that word responsive. So can you do a compare and contrast? How has this process changed how Quinault government functions, and why?
Yes, sure. So when you look at a basic strategic plan that has administrative goals and objectives, it's very short-sighted. As I mentioned earlier, you have 1, 2, 3, 5-year, maybe a 10-year plan. But the way it's transformed how we do things at Quinault, it's transformed it in a number of ways. But more significantly, it looks at those issues that are outside of Quinault government. And it brings that perspective of our tribal citizens into the work that we do. And so that's very significant, that it's not just an organizational tool and document, but we really have a firm pulse on what the community is thinking at any given time, and the organization is able to respond and shift to what people are thinking at the time. For example, this last year, the governor declared a state of emergency and drought in a rainforest, and we saw decline of our fish. And a lot of our citizens were very concerned because there were parts of the Quinault River you could walk across. Now, if we did a strategic plan 5, 10 years ago, it wouldn't have captured that. But when we have those kind of issues and we have a point of entry for our citizens to influence the organization and our direction, then we're able to be very responsive and dynamic as an organization. And so we've created those opportunities. And I think the second thing is, when citizens know they have a voice, they know they could come to council and there'll be decisions made and the administration adjusted to meet that need. There's an element of trust. And so I think the example I talked about last week in pulling together a good 30 of our citizens around a fishing issue is an example. They know that they're there and they have some trust that if I'm going to take the time to sit down with my elected officials, I'm going to be heard, there's going to be a response, and we're going to see some actionable planning. So I think that's a key issue that makes a huge difference in how we conduct business.
So let's talk a little bit more about the Quinnovation initiative. At the core of this initiative is what's described as an 8-step cycle. Can you briefly describe what these 8 steps are and how this cyclical process is designed to continuously strengthen? I know, yeah. And then, again, in a nutshell, yes, if you can, but how it's designed to continuously strengthen Quinault's governance over time.
Okay. Yes. So the 8 steps, we begin with the community engagement, direct community engagement. From that, we then take that public input to our tribal council. We look at, are there strategic initiatives that could come out of this? From tribal council, we delegate to the staff to develop plans. Staff then present strategic plans to the council. We then go back out to the public to basically validate, make sure that what they told us is accurate, what our staff have implemented are not only what reflects their desire, but on taking a second look, is there a way we could improve this? So it's both a validation as well as try to further enhance with a second public review. And then once it goes back out to the public and we get that input, comes back to the council for final approval. And then after we approve, then we engage in oversight. So we kick the year off quarterly, ensuring that the goals and objectives are met, the preferred future conditions we're looking at, and we're hearing from the public on progress.
So a key step of the initiative is Quinault's full embrace of performance-based budgeting.
Yes.
Or what's been termed budgeting for outcomes. Can you explain why Quinault designed this approach, and how does it work in practice?
Sure. So we wanted to make sure that the dollars we invest make a difference in the lives of Quinault people. We had very limited dollars. When I looked, for example, at our self-governance funding for education, year after year, it's the same amount of money. And we thought, what are some of the other things we could do in terms of education? What about those employees that maybe, working out in the field that want to become a pharmacist? So sort of cross-training. What about those that are out in the field and they want to move up in the ranks? So we wanted to create an ability for upward mobility, sideways mobility, points of entry for tribal citizens that aren't currently employees. And we just wanted to create a process where people would be able to know and understand this is Quinault and this is, so we wanted to budget for outcomes that were consistent with growing our labor force and giving them many opportunities and options for growth, because we felt if we could unleash the passion and the dreams of each of our individual citizens as they serve the nation, they're going to be excellent employees. They're going to have personal fulfillment and satisfaction. They're going to come up with some amazing things for us. So we wanted to unleash our workforce and really support them the best way that we could. So that was one of the major reasons we wanted to budget for outcomes. But secondarily is we wanted to serve the community. We wanted to make sure that of those tribal citizens that come in and serve, they are there in a position where they have open ears, open hearts, and open minds to the needs of our community, and they're able to then build plans that reflect the community. And so we wanted to create this outcome, and we wanted to budget for those outcomes. So it was, in designing a dynamic organization, it was serving the public, it was being responsive to the public, and it was giving the tribal council an opportunity to really be that garner for, hearing from the public, hearing from the staff, hearing from our youth, and taking that leadership role in advancing the nation.
So in that vein, how does Quinault, the leadership, the governmental process, hold departmental staff accountable for good performance in terms of advancing those priorities and maximizing the impact of the dollars that each department does receive? So when departments make their annual pitch for the budget, we look at what goals they have. We look at how many citizens are they serving. We look at how does this fit with things that we've accomplished thus far. How is it advancing some of our prior goals and objectives? And we look at real-time information from our citizens, from the public engagement. What are the current issues? And oftentimes, and I should say every year, tribal nations, we never have enough money to fund all the needs. So it becomes a matter of being very strategic and prioritizing to get the best return on the investment. So we go through a process where we let the staff put their best plans forward. We have the public engagement, and we try to, blend those two things, along with, individual elected officials have a certain vision of what they want to accomplish when they take the oath of office, and they commit and sacrifice day in, day out in serving the people. And so we try to take all of those things and go back out to the public and present our budget. So once we do a national budget, it's posted and we have public hearings. We also designed our budget process where people can submit written comment to the national budget. And so there's many ways of validating it, but ultimately that's how it's designed. We want to be able to create that opportunity for the staff. And then to hold them accountable, we have the quarterly oversight hearings.
And so once we put all those into play and we approve the plans, the work doesn't end there. It's just beginning, because now it's time for implementation and execution of the plans. And so each quarter, at the close of the quarter, our financials are due within 15 days. Within the 30 days, at the close of each quarter, we convene an oversight hearing, and the directors are called before the council. They basically testify before our tribal council, and they provide an executive summary report. We also ask them to identify barriers and what are some of the reasons you may have fallen short, and then we try to make an adjustment if it's a budget issue, if it's staffing. So in that regard, we look at budgeting our forecasts, and sometimes we may receive more revenue than we expected, and we can make that adjustment rather than waiting for a whole fiscal year to go by. We want to make sure that we're in touch both with our expenditures and our new revenues. And we've been doing a lot of new things the last few years that are generating additional revenue streams. So we've had the luxury of flexibility of adding new things. But again, the goal is before any new dollar comes into our national treasury, we want that dollar to already be thought out strategically and broadly and responsive to our community.
And what's really, a couple things that are really intrigued me, have always intrigued me about this is, one is the way you describe how you allocate the money, the revenue, the funding that comes in from the outside, the revenues that you generate yourself. You talk about it in very different terms than most tribal governments and tribal leaders view your assets that you have to apply to make a difference in the lives of your people. You talk about investments, and you talk about departments coming to you and making their pitch. That's not how most tribal governments work. If the funding that's available to the tribe 1 year goes up 5%, they usually just bump everybody's budget up 5%, and it's not as surgical as you've laid it out. The other thing that I'm struck by is, and I've taken a look at some of the documentation that you ask department heads to provide around this quarterly process. And it's very much geared to explaining to the Quinault people how you're making headway on the priorities that they have set out in place and that the government is working to advance. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect?
Yes, sure. So when we schedule our quarterly oversight hearings, it's a three-part agenda. The first part of the agenda, the directors report on performance. So they give a report, goals, objectives, strategic initiatives, preferred future conditions. The second part of the agenda is financial, and that's where we talk about the budget, and we talk about whether it's sufficient, whether we need additional appropriations, and then the third part of the agenda is open public discussion. So that's where our citizens have an opportunity to then directly engage in the oversight process. So that's how it's designed in terms of our quarterly oversight. Throughout the quarter, we'll convene public hearings on various issues, and that's another opportunity we have. Anytime we convene public hearings, or we call them town meetings too, just get-togethers with our citizens. We'll invite the staff, and oftentimes we'll have members of our subcommittee with our staff, and so any question that may come from the audience and from the Quinault citizenry, we have the right people in the room. They're able to express their concerns and issues, that they're able to get an answer, and it's not, well, we have to get back to our staff and we'll get back to you. We like to get everyone in the room at the same time. So in that way, that's how we're responsive to the citizenry.
So can you share a particular example of this budgeting for outcomes approach and why and how it works better than the way you did it before?
Sure. So I think the early example that I talked about with the Blueback restoration project, that was one. We certainly don't have the federal funds through self-governance or any other federal source to undertake the type of restoration effort we needed. But it was very important to our citizens. Our prize sockeye salmon that define who we are as Quinault people are near 3,000 when they were millions in the 50s and 60s. We have to take immediate action. We have to take direct action. That was very clear from the public engagement piece. We then met with our staff. Actually, we took that information, went to council. Council directed staff then through a resolution, we need a plan. We need to figure this out. And let's not work within the confines of limited federal funds. Let's look at this broadly. So the staff then put together some ideas. We had some reports from the Bureau of Reclamation and other federal agency reports, scientific reports that said the hardening of the bank along the Quinault River accelerated the flow, wiped out 2.5 miles of spawning habitat. That's an issue that's outside the control of Quinault. It has a direct impact on our prized sockeye. And so we knew we needed to take a comprehensive approach. So following that direction, the staff then briefed the council, and they said, we recommend we construct engineered log jams. It's new science. And again, we send the message to our staff. We don't want just business as usual. If we have a problem, what are best practices? How can we bring best practices to Quinault to solve our major challenges? And so this engineered logjam, phase 1, was considered best practice. And that required a lot of work. It was very expensive. It required federal permits. It required working with the county, the state, the federal government, a bunch of federal agencies. It required working with private landowners. But after we put that plan, had a budget, we were then able to successfully lobby the state legislature, lobby Congress. We had all the permits. We met with the public, not just the Quinault public, but the landowners in the adjacent area. We were able to build a broad coalition. From March to October, we had the plan approved and in the spring, and we were able to get the permits, the funding and construction, and a first phase engineered log jams by that October. It was amazing. But that is a testament of the power of being very clear in identifying the issue, providing full political support for the solution, and then recognizing that many of these issues are outside of sort of our normal budget and just kind of going along with status quo. I mean, if we went along with status quo and just being content with the federal funds we have and complaining we don't have enough, the Blueback may have disappeared. But it took the ability to have this type of budgeting process where, again, it's not confined to a sterile in an organizational vacuum. It's broadening it to an 80-year legacy project. So I think that's a great example of how we took budgeting for outcomes, and we weren't limited by federal funds, or we weren't limited by our our resources.
I want to talk a little bit more now about something you shared a little bit earlier about unleashing your workforce.
Yes.
In addition to the Quinnovation initiative, Quinault's begun advancing the nation's long-term strategic plan, one critical step further, which is its launch of this 3-phase overhaul of its governmental employment system. Can you provide a brief overview of this new, what's called the job architecture framework, and what it involves?
Yes. So when we were looking at our workforce, I was just shocked at one point. We had an employee that had been with the Quinault Nation since the 70s. During that entire tenure, the only increase they ever realized was a COLA. And they had the same job description they had from the 70s, but yet they were doing, obviously, multiple things. The work that they were doing for the Quinault Nation was dramatically different than it was in the 70s. And to me, I thought, how many other employees are in this similar situation? And how are managers and directors evaluating the performance of an employee if there's a job description that doesn't even reflect what they're doing on the ground? So that was the first order of business. Let's look at all the job descriptions to make sure that they're reflective of what we're trying to accomplish and what the expectation is for every employee. When we looked at the job descriptions, I realized that much of our workforce was paid at a level that they were so far off the fair market value scale, they weren't even on the scale. And that was true for a good part of our workforce. And to me, I thought, but for their commitment and dedication, they wouldn't be here. And it's unconscionable, and I actually use the term unconscionable for the nation to have these expectations of employees and then compensate them at a significantly less than fair market value. It's just not right. So we started looking at how can we best compensate. So, and through that analysis, we found we had executive assistants, secretaries, receptionists. We had different, families of similar functions. But you would have an executive secretary making $12 an hour and a receptionist making significantly more. And so there was no rhyme nor reason for how the positions were structured, how the pay scale was structured. oftentimes, and I heard this throughout my first term, that in granting raises or merit increases, it was all dependent upon the budget availability. Well, some budgets were, they had training dollars. Other budgets, it was just basic salary. They had no room for advancement, and so it was very ad hoc. And so we wanted to create this structure where there'd be consistency. There'd be consistency in job functions, so the job descriptions would be very functional, based on and driven by the organization, not driven by personality, because a lot of it was driven by personality. The second thing is fair market value for that function. And so we created a step process, and we created an architecture where we have families, and within each department, we had another structure, and it was technical, advisory, managerial, so we had different skill sets. So, our expectation is if you're a supervisor, you have a certain skill set wherever you are within the nation. If you're a manager, you should have a certain skill set. If you're a director, a certain skill set. And so we wanted to create that structure and opportunity. And if someone was frontline and they wanted to become a director, they would know exactly what skill sets they needed to acquire to be eligible for advancement. And so it was a way to structure an advancement where employees would be rewarded in two ways. They'd be rewarded by virtue of being longevity and tenure. You're gonna have an expectation of, if you commit the time and you gain seniority, you're gonna move up, even if you're in the same position. We also wanted to create an expectation, if you want advancement, whether it's within your subject matter, or if you want to go to a completely different part of the nation, there's a point of entry, and you know exactly what kind of education and training you need, and there's an expectation. Again, it's not based on personality, who you are, who your family is. It's based on you as an individual, the commitment you have to serving the Quinault Nation, the willingness you have to invest in training and getting experience, and we wanted to reward performance. So if you're a high performer, we also created that as a metric for providing financial incentive and reward. So by virtue of tenure, training, and performance, if you can do all those things, you're going to rise through the ranks at Quinault.
So a key part of phase 2 of this process is this, you mentioned career families and also career streams. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about those and how they work and how they convey to either someone who's considering a job in Quinault government or somebody who's already working in Quinault government and looking at how do I advance through the ranks, how that helps them see what the bright line path is forward?
Okay, so a career family, that would be like natural resources. If you're in forestry, there's a whole family of, you could be a pre-sale forester, you could be a forester, you could be a harvest manager. There's a lot of different things you could do in forestry. Same with fisheries, same with law enforcement. So we have these various families, and if you come in at an entry level, you'll know that you have certain training to advance within your stream, or if you want a little variation off that stream into wildlife protection or habitat, there's an expectation there. And then as far as streams, the upward mobility, there's that expectation too. So you could rise within the ranks, or you could go to a completely different department and know that there's certain skill sets that you need.
So on an overarching level, doesn't this new approach and those two things in particular, career streams and career families, send a clear message to those considering employment with the tribe or already working for the tribe that the expectation is advancement?
Yes.
The expectation is you're going to invest in yourself in order to prepare to advance, to perform well, and move up through the ranks.
Yes, absolutely. If someone wants to just, excuse me, if someone wants to just come in and serve and have a job, you can come in and serve and have a job. You're going to have a base pay. You're going to stay in the same place, but and you'll rise with tenure. But if you really want to make that investment of your time, your energy, your passion, you're going to be rewarded. And if you're going to make that commitment to the Quinault citizenry, that was another thing that we wanted to somehow include in our performance agreements. responsiveness to the community. I mean, that's a neat way of evaluating the performance of an employee, but those are all fundamental things that expectations we have for each employee, and they're going to know very clearly what those are. They're going to know what that path is, and it's going to be up to them, ultimately, the choice, and we want to be there to empower them. And we wanted it self-executing. As I mentioned before, with the one employee that had been there since the 70s, there was nothing that was self-executing to boost that individual, but yet they had 40 years of experience with the Quinault Nation. And so that was another major issue that I wanted to ensure existed within Quinault, that an employee would not have to go to a supervisor, to a manager, to a director, around and around trying to get a pay raise and having to basically beg for a pay raise. I wanted a process where it would be self-executing. An employee, if they had certain tenure and if they acquired certain skills through training that was laid out in the expectations, they were going to get it, and it wasn't going to be a point of negotiation. So in that regard, I thought that would be, we thought that would be a good way to boost morale, because so often when you're in a government employee situation, there's a lot of morale issues. And so we wanted to make sure that that part of employee satisfaction, which is ranked as one of the highest, measurements of employee satisfaction, is, are you compensated fairly and are you treated well? And so we knew that there were underlying issues that went beyond just subject matter expertise and beyond spending time with an organization, but it was really about understanding the employee where they were and giving them that opportunity, and really ultimately leaving the choice up to them.
So another primary motivation of this three-phase overhaul, the job architecture framework, is to increase the number and percentage of Quinault citizens working in Quinault government. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that and why that emphasis?
Yes, so we have a number of Quinault citizens, and it's interesting you raised that point. We've grown our enterprises, and I heard a comment last week that we're now starting to compete against each other for our employees. Our enterprises have picked up similar. They just conducted 30 employees with some excellent management training over a 12-week period. And so we have a desire to ensure that every Quinault citizen that is employable has that choice if they want to come work for the tribe, the government, or our enterprises. And for us, we just find that when we have our citizens in key positions, we don't have to deal with the turnover, because oftentimes we're a training ground. People will come to work for Quinault, they'll get the training, then they'll go to the state and get $10,000 more a year. And so we're from a human resources perspective, I learned that each time there's an employee turnover, it costs an organization about $30,000. And so that was a major drain. But if we can invest in our own citizens and provide that opportunity and support them with the training, not only sending them to college, but once they come into the workforce, supporting their educational goals, because we all know education goes well beyond collegiate life. And so having our own citizens be the eyes, ears, voice of Quinault within our workforce, we just know that they're going to stick around, they're going to be within the organization for a long time, they're going to reflect our values, they're going to negotiate issues from a position of strength because they have that Quinault mindset, and they're going to know that they have a tribe that supports them.
So following up on that, phase 3 of this three-phase overhaul creates new deputy director positions across the government. So why this particular step, and how does that further that priority of increasing the number and percentage of Quinault people working in the government?
So having the deputy director positions, at one point we had 5 directors, all were non-Quinault citizens. We just did not have Quinault citizens that had the education, training, and if they did, they weren't applying. So we were very challenged with getting our executive management team comprised of Quinault citizens. And so by creating a deputy director position, we thought that would be a way to attract or incentivize a Quinault citizen that may be qualified, that are working for another tribe or even another state. We've had Quinaults educated and leave the state. But it would also give them an opportunity to learn and basically be an apprentice under a director, to learn the budgeting, to learn the administrative things. And we would be looking at soft skills as well. So it was a way of creating a point of entry for a management position to attract someone that may be already within the organization or to attract Quinaults back home.
So this is, from everything I've read, heard from you and others, this is a complete transformation of how Quinault government operated.
Yes.
How are you, your fellow leaders, people that currently work in government, working to educate the people, both employees and non-employees, about how this works, why you're going this route, how it will do things like advance the strategic plan, advance Quinnovation, and everything else? I mean, I would assume there was some pushback to this because
Yes.
it's so different from the way you used to do things.
Yes. To answer your last question on the pushback, yes, there was obviously a lot of pushback, and in large part it came from our staff, because our staff were used to a certain way of doing things. And interestingly, after the first year, many of the staff that were complaining were actually praising the process, because when it came time to report their progress, they had a very key strategic document and made it so much easier. And so while we had a lot of pushback initially, it took a while, but once people understood where we were coming from and what we were trying to accomplish, and they could see the product, and they could see the citizens respond, and they could see the ability to answer, questions before council, and that gave us, a finite template of performance and financials. We weren't interested in whatever political issue happened last week, and we're not going to grill you as a council on those. We're going to talk to you about basic subject matter, expectations, performance, and budget. It created, I think, a sense of trust between the workforce and the elected body, and so that was a good thing. But getting the message out to our citizens, that we've done in a number of ways. At our annual general council meeting, I've talked about it in the state of, our State of the Nation address. We've issued magazine articles. We've produced magazines. At our annual meeting, we've had handouts. We had the Quinnovation roadmap that was released widely throughout the organization. We've had citizens that provide their names and addresses that wanted more information. So we just did we had a communication plan to get the word out and the messaging. And in large part because there's so many citizens engaged in the process. Those same citizens were, our advocates, to the other citizens, that they participate in this, and really liked it. So with regard to our employees, we've had all staff meetings. We've rolled out Quinnovation. We've had staff memos, staff meetings. They've heard through their department heads. Council has had meetings with directors. So there's a lot of interrelationships within any organization, whether it's council staff, council executive management team, frontline employees. But we've just tried to ensure that in all those interrelationships, that we're all on the same page and talking about it.
So one final wrap-up question on this topic. So we've talked about three things. We've talked about first the strategic plan, then Quinnovation, and the performance-based budgeting aspect of that, and then this job architecture framework. I guess the question would be, how do they all work in concert? How does, for instance, the job architecture framework advance those other two things?
Okay, so the job architecture framework requires that for advancement you reach certain performance metrics. We take those metrics directly out of the strategic planning process. So when the council approves, our annual work plan, each director will know these are the things I'm responsible for. And they're named specifically. There's very specific tasks. There's very specific goals. They accomplish those. They advance the agenda, the strategy. They're going to be incentivized and rewarded. So that's how those two things interact. And then with regard to frontline employees, the directors are able to include those in that employee's personal evaluation. There's a place for training. There's a place for recognition if they want to move up. But it's all tied toward the community-driven strategic plan.
Well, it sounds incredibly impressive, yes. And I look forward to seeing how it unfolds as you guys move forward. Well, that's all the time we have on today's episode of Sovereignty in Action, a program of the National Congress of American Indians. To learn more about Sovereignty in Action, please visit NCAI's website at www.ncai.org. Thank you for joining us. Copyright 2016, National Congress of American Indians.